Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Singupta. Today is June 13th, 2023, and this is for Medical Biochemistry 1005. Today we will be looking at the Unit 2 Case Connections presentation, and the two problems I chose to work on were the 16-year-old with the glycogen deficiency, glycogen phosphorylase deficiency, as well as the 8-week-old infant that has one of the given answers. So the 16-year-old female, she comes in with her mother, and she's been recently diagnosed with muscle glycogen phosphorylase deficiency, and they want to know what the heck is it. So muscle glycogen is the relatively available stored form of glucose or sugar in our bodies. We naturally run off of carbohydrates or sugars, and it's important that this energy is readily available for not only locomotion as well as our physiological functions that take place all day long. However, when we go from rest to exercise and exercise to vigorous exercise, our body has a few different metabolic pathways that it bounces back and forth in between based on how vigorous the exercise is. Exercise that's anaerobic in nature, or meaning without the supply of oxygen, demands we tap into our stored forms of glycogen, especially under prolonged periods of anaerobic exercise. Not that we can maintain it forever, but up to about a minute and a half, 2 minutes really is where we see glycogen storage become depleted under maximal exertion. And then we fall into our oxidative phosphorylation pathway, or we start using fats as fuels. So I would explain this to her in the sense that the glycogen that's stored intramuscularly will be broken down once the glucose in the bloodstream becomes relatively depleted to the point where we now need to start using the energy stored within our muscles to supply the muscles with energy in order to complete that activity. Running, for example, I ran the 400-meter dash in track and field, and this is one of the more demanding races in track and field. Not that they're all not difficult in their own way, but the 400-meter dash is unique in the sense that during the course of that event, you deplete all of your stored ATP, PCR within the muscle, or your adenosine triphosphate is depleted, and your phosphocreatine levels are attempting to rebuild that ATP as fast as possible. But it's taking longer than 10 to 15 to 20 seconds on the far end of that spectrum that the ATP PCR system can supply. So then we need to start breaking down the glycogen stored intramuscularly. And depending upon how vigorously you're exercising, that glycogen storage will deplete. And if this young lady is unable to break down that glycogen, then she's going to experience some symptoms that otherwise healthy individuals don't necessarily exhibit. So in a nutshell, with her body being unable to break down the stored glycogen, she may find that under vigorous exercise, or even just initially getting started with exercise, she'll experience some pains and some discomfort. Which leads us to her next question of physical activity. So she stated she really likes to take long walks with her friends. Would she still be able to do that? And my initial reaction to this question is that most certainly she should still continue to do the activities that she currently enjoys: walking, swimming, kayaking, biking, anything that's going to be beneficial for her health, like physical activity. Then there's no reason for her to stop doing that. When we're talking about patients or people with glycogen phosphorylase deficiency, in the medical community, this is known as McArdle's disease. So from here on out, I'll address glycogen phosphorylase deficiency as McArdle's disease. And everything regarding this disease in the medical community state that exercise as tolerable is the best method for exercising and getting in your steps and being as active as you should be, as well as living the lifestyle that you want to. These people are unable to break down the stored glycogen, but being able to participate in those activities is what's going to allow them to adhere to a healthy lifestyle for the rest of their life, which we all should be doing. but specifically these patients have a little bit more of a challenging approach to exercise and physical activity. When McArdle's disease is caught, it's typically earlier on in life by a pediatrician or maybe even a general practitioner, a family medical practitioner that they're seeing. But now that she's 16 years old, it's been brought to her attention and now our attention that she's experiencing some symptoms. And what's typically seen earlier in life or as they're growing and developing, pediatricians can find hepatomegaly, delayed puberty, osteopenia, they're short in stature, hyperlipidemia. These are all signs and symptoms and lab values that they come across in an attempt to identify what's actually causing this problem. And sometimes it leads towards this McArdle's disease. But when she's exercising or wanting to exercise, where that intolerance can specifically be pointed to is during the metabolic pathway of glycogenolysis as uridine 5-diphosphate or UDP glucose converts into a short chain glucose polymer. So researchers have suggested that long-term steady state aerobic exercise is what's going to be most beneficial for patients with McArdle's disease, specifically to lean more on the oxidative phosphorylative metabolic pathway to supply the energy demands as opposed to doing this high intensity anaerobic exercise, which certainly requires glycogenolysis, and maybe she can avoid some of those pains that she experiences, like going from rest to exercise. That initial onset is where a lot of patients with McArdle's disease experience discomfort, and maybe we can mitigate for that and she can enjoy a lifelong habit of exercise and physical activity and well-being. And the next question as far as dealing with this McArdle's disease goes is, does she have to get up in the middle of the night to have some form of glucose intake that's going to allow her to try and mitigate for those pains or her symptoms that are onset during exercise? And from what I could find in the research was pretty conflicting as far as the type of diet she should intake. However, I didn't find any research stating that she should eat in the middle of the night in order to maintain her blood glucose levels. Now, the two perspectives that I mostly came across when researching nutrition for McArdle's disease was either a high glucose diet, so things high in sucrose and fructose, and in order to try and keep the body from breaking down stored glycogen, or an attempt to, rather, and keep glucose levels high in the bloodstream so it's more readily available. But as we know as medical practitioners and researchers, that excess glucose in the bloodstream over prolonged periods of time can certainly lead to a whole host of ailments that are specific to just having high blood glucose levels. The other side of the research was leaning more towards a ketogenic diet, things high in poly and mono, unsaturated fats, lean proteins. Fish was big on the list because it has both of those in there, legumes, nuts, other sources of lean protein, chicken. So keeping the carbohydrates low in that sense in order to try and avoid the body converting any of that into glycogen is the idea behind the ketogenic diet. And as a clinical exercise physiologist, I've had some patients come in that are ketogenic, and some of them do really well and say they love it and they feel better than ever. And others state that they have a mental fog and they're not as clear. They also are very lethargic and have zero energy or ambition to do anything throughout the day. And this comes back to the statement that carbohydrates are our fuel. We naturally use sugars for all of our physiological processes, both our daily activity as well as things that we're not even consciously aware that are happening. So a lot of this is going to be trial and error, experimentation for this young lady as to what makes her feel better and what makes her feel worse. So I thought this was a pretty interesting point, though, here about trying to either avoid carbohydrates entirely or to just saturate your body with the simple sugars so that your body has a higher glucose supply in the bloodstream, and you can just bank off of that as opposed to trying to tap into your reserves. So the last question they had regarded lactate accumulation from anaerobic exercise. And the current research out there states that patients with McArdle's disease, as well as healthy patients, didn't really exhibit any differences intramuscularly as far as lactate accumulation went. However, the patients with McArdle's disease did show an abnormally large increase in muscle adenosine diphosphate and plasma NH3, which suggests an increased adenine nucleotide degradation. Typically, this has been known as an emergency mechanism for energy generation, and healthy individuals don't exhibit this physiological function. So what is this to be said then about this lactate accumulation? I mean, we know lactate is oxidized more rapidly than other carbohydrates and is converted into pyruvate. And another point they had in this study was that the protein content of the monocarboxylate transporter MCT1, which is responsible for the facilitation of lactate uptake, has been shown to be higher in skeletal muscles of McArdle disease patients, indicating an important mechanism for increasing the availability of pyruvate, which ultimately indicates the capacity for delivery and oxidation of bloodborne fuels to increase with exercise and training. So while the lactate accumulation isn't greater in patients with McArdle's disease than otherwise healthy patients or individuals, the body is still brilliant at supplying the energy for the energy demands that it's placed under. So I found that pretty interesting. You know, we see that there's some conflicting research out there regarding the best ways to approach McArdle's, and just like any other topic, you know, there's usually a scientist on one side of the coin and a scientist on the other. So I think that states then clearly that this is going to be entirely experimental for this young lady, and it's going to be up to her to find what works best as far as nutrition goes, as far as exercise routine and how vigorously she's exercising. All that's going to come into play as she grows into young adulthood and find what's most enjoyable for her as far as physically and what makes her feel the best so she can adhere to it for a lifetime. So hopefully that answered some of their questions and maybe they got a little bit better of an understanding. But the next case that I wanted to review for this project was the one about the 8-week-old baby and his or her seemingly intolerance to the breastfeeding over periods of time. A little side note, this has been deemed the best haircut or hairdo for an 8-week-old baby. I don't even have that much hair now, so kudos to this little man. But hereditary fructose intolerance, galactosemia, glycogen storage disease, all of these ailments have similar symptoms. So it's kind of difficult to choose which one it might be. So I'll explain to you why I think it's glycogen storage disease or GSD. So HFI or hereditary fructose intolerance can typically be diagnosed as the patient is being weaned off of breastfeeding and is now starting to ingest solid foods or even formula that has sucrose and fructose and these other simple sugars in there, which cause all of these which can cause these symptoms. So for that, I ruled HFI out. Galactosemia, I thought, was the answer because everything I was reading led towards breastfeeding and problems that arise from breastfeeding. Yes, hello, I'm almost done with it. So, but when a baby's born, galactosemia typically can be identified by the physician. They do a heel prick and they run the blood through the lab, and that can be detected earlier on then. So seeing as the baby's 2 months old now, I thought maybe the timeline was a little bit off here. Glycogen storage disease, however, also exhibiting the same symptoms, hepatomegaly, hypoglycemia, all the same as the other two. I thought the key factor here was the hypoglycemia despite the epinephrine injection. I think that really relates to the fact that the glycogen storage is unable to be broken down, and there's some form of disease with the way it's stored, and we don't see a spike in blood glucose, which is typical for epinephrine injection. And then glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency relates to red blood cells, and we know red blood cells carry oxygenated blood to the tissues, so I thought that wasn't the answer there. So I'm sorry it's 15 minutes, but thank you for your time, doctor. We'll see.